So I am absolutely delighted to open this conference now with what I think is going to be one of our incredible keynote events in the conference. Although there will be many incredible events, I know, but I'm delighted to invite Baroness Chakrabarti, who is President of Birkbeck College, which is one of the Federation of University of London members, and who's going to talk to us about humane online and distance education, which I think is going to be a fantastic topic.
Well, thank you, Professor, and thanks to all of you for the enormous honour and pleasure of being able to speak so early in such an important conference. As you've heard, I'm the President of Birkbeck, and whilst I've been involved in many universities over the years, really in tandem with my principal career as a human rights lawyer and activist. Becoming President of Birkbeck last year really is a career highlight for me. And the reason for that is that Birkbeck values, like the values of your conference and of Code and RIDE, are so connected with my own. And that's not just about the transformative power of education, which I know we're all inspired by, but it's about inclusion in particular. When I think of Birkbeck and when I think of what you're trying to do with online and distance and transnational education, I think about the capacity to turbocharge inclusion and thereby extend this transformative power of education to so many more people in exciting and innovative and ethical ways. I certainly owe all the best things in my life to a wonderful education provided by the UK state, and by the way, without being troubled by things like tuition fees. In fact, the UK state pretty much paid me to go to university and paid for my law books, which, again, before the online revolution, were very expensive indeed. So I feel I owe so much to that education, and as I say, therefore feel particularly honoured to be here. Not least having had the pleasure of dipping into the recent book, Online and Distant Learning for a Connected World. And as you can imagine, as a human rights lawyer and campaigner, the many chapters that look at the ethical side of the piece and the inclusion side of the piece in particular, the opportunities and the challenges, I found that very exciting and reassuring indeed. Just to give you a little context, I was born in the year that man was to land on the moon. So that's, for those of you that can't remember offhand, that's 1969. So obviously that was the great technical innovation of that year, but nonetheless, as a reminder, that was a world without mobile phones or computers. And so my primary education, even really my secondary education, is a world away, and indeed my higher education is a world away from what it is for current generations. But I did live through the invention of the internet, which of course was as important an innovation as the printing press in its day, with all the fears that would have excited in some minds, but the enormous opportunity that the invention of the printing press gave to so many people who would never have had the opportunity to read and write and publish before then. And I do think that the internet is equivalent to that innovation. And of course, now we're heading into another industrial revolution and educational revolution with artificial intelligence, which we no doubt will touch upon. I'll say a little in a few minutes, and I know that you will clearly touch upon this in your deliberations today. At my secondary school, I was thinking about this on the way to the conference this morning. There was a real contrast between two rooms in the school building. One was the computer room and the other was the library. And the nature of these two rooms, the atmosphere in these two rooms and the people that populated these two rooms could not have been more different and more alien to how we would see inclusive learning today. Now, you know, in the early 80s, you can imagine to even have a computer room in a state school in North London was probably quite an achievement. And the computer, singular, was obviously an enormous and clunky thing. But those who used it and those who were encouraged to use it, like those who studied quote unquote computer studies, were not considered to be academically gifted or promising students. I was rarely encouraged to go in that room, nor did I learn to type even at school. So essentially that room was for the girls. It was a girls' school who ought to begin to learn to type, because there might be a future for them, a good future in a typing pool. This is not that long ago. This is not that long ago. So that was the computer room. By contrast, the library, that's a place of real learning. That's where the books are. Surely that is the gateway to an academic future and all the professional possibilities that will come from that. And I spent a fair bit of time in there, but it has to be said, before I even got to school, I grew up in a house full of books. And think about the different opportunities to people and young people and children in particular, from being born and raised in a house full of books to one without, except that now everybody can be in the world of learning and reading and writing and information and opportunity, not least because of the types of innovation that you will be discussing today, that you have been discussing and researching and considering for these last 2 decades, as so brilliantly reflected in that book. I'm sure you've all read it, but anyone that hasn't, it's a good accessible read without tons of jargon, and thank you for that. You can imagine the sigh of relief when I could actually understand what I was reading. So as I said, I only learnt to type later as a pupil barrister, and used part of my pupillage award, my scholarship, to buy my first primitive laptop. And that was in 1994. That's only 32 years ago, only. You really know you're middle-aged, don't you, when you say things like only 32 years ago. You also know you're middle-aged when it feels like breakfast comes around every 15 minutes, but that's another matter. Taught myself to type from an online course. And how wrong my lovely school teachers were to think that the computer room and learning to type should only be for those who might work in a typing pool. Can anyone remember the concept of a typing pool today? You know, this is the revolution that we have lived through in our recent lifetimes. But of course, post qualifying at the bar, and certainly in my subsequent years as a human rights campaigner and activist, those computing skills and that access to the internet has been totally transformative, has been the library, is the library to all intents and purposes, in terms of the ability to communicate with people all over the world, almost in real time, especially in terrifying times as like the moment. So it's been a game changer and has leveled the playing field in so many ways between the powerful, who used to own the libraries and curate the libraries, and those who would never have had access to all of that information. But of course, there are risks too. And there must be balance in this conversation. I know that you are all wanting to be alive to the challenges and the risks, as Linda said in her introduction. We know that social media it can be a wonderful democratizing thing, but we know about its dark side as well. And from a human rights perspective, that dark side can involve inhuman and degrading treatment, especially but not exclusively towards women. People have been driven to all sorts of negative places, dragged down rabbit holes, and that is a real danger. Social media combined with artificial intelligence, abuse, discrimination, fake news, the ability to manipulate even democratic elections, all of that is possible, as well as all the exciting stuff that you'll be discussing. Two short anecdotes just from this week. Just this week in the House of Lords, we debated an amendment around computer-generated evidence in courts. The notorious case being, of course, the Post Office Horizon Fujitsu scandal. I give you those sub-postmasters who suffered the most terrible miscarriages of justice, being falsely accused of fraud because of faulty software and corrupt and abusive, powerful people, telling them that the machine is perfect, the software is perfect, and of course it was highly flawed and open to human manipulation. And those postmasters went to prison, were bankrupted, committed suicide. Now, this is not from the educational space, but you're the educators. I'm just giving you my perspective as a reminder that we must guard against things like manipulation and work towards things like transparency as a key to accountability and inclusion. And similarly, this week, we discussed evidence that is being used to send too many young Black men to prison, in particular, the joint enterprise cases, where their musical tastes, their interest in rap and drill music is sometimes being used as evidence of criminal proclivity or intention. Imagine that. So imagine you've been watching too many, I don't know, Mario Puzo, Godfather type movies on your Netflix account, and someone suggests that is relevant to criminal intention or proclivity. You know, the dangers of this kind of assumption, the dangers for discrimination. And I would suggest that those kind of dangers, perhaps not as dramatically, are possible in the educational space too. And I'm thinking in particular of assessment, whether it's assessment for who should be allowed in to a course, or whether it's assessment of educators, or whether it is assessment for the purposes of awarding degrees and so on. It is incredibly important. And it becomes even more important in the context of advanced and artificial intelligence, that the data that is being fed into the algorithm is of sufficient quality and is not rubbish in, rubbish out. Because if we are not careful, instead of championing inclusion, we could be baking in discrimination and hardwiring every previous injustice into software and into a system. I know you don't need to be told that. So on the one hand, this great possibility of wider communication, collaboration, inclusion in higher education in particular, but on the other end, the dangers not just of discrimination, but isolation and polarisation, which are the opposite of a great educational experience. And as I say, having looked at your book, I know that these issues are all there, and no doubt these issues are for you to tease out later in the day. A humane online education would use these tools to broaden inclusion, to make it easier for disabled people, people of all classes and economic backgrounds and all over the world, to get access in ways they never would before, because of the physical and economic constraints of travel, for example, let alone educational materials. But if we get it wrong, we could be doing the opposite. We could be unfair and unequal in the availability and access, and in particular in the standards of assessment. Now, I don't say that to be discouraging. I say it with the opposite intention, because what is incredibly important is that a world-class collection of educators like you set the gold standard, and set a standard not only for your own institution and institutions, but set the standard for the world as to what the key rules are going to be at the design stage and the delivery stage, in all the tools and the courses that you design, and in the approach to this technology that you recommend for the future. It's a pivotal moment, I think. It could go either way, but I feel confident. I feel confident that with your values and your experience, you will more than meet this challenge. And I wish you all the best, not just for today, but in meeting this challenge for the future. Thanks again for listening.
Oh, thank you. That was quite an inspirational start, wasn't it? Thank you. Let's just give another round of applause, because I think thank you, Shanley. That really got us in the space. We've got some questions coming in on the poll everywhere, so thank you to people who are typing in, and including our online audience. But we have got a couple of microphones if people wanted to start in the room. If anybody has a comment or a question, then please raise your hand, and Ash will bring the mic around. Okay, I'm going to just go to one of our questions on the board, and I just wanted to pick up really on the fact that this is such an international conference. In the room and online, we've got colleagues from so many parts of the world who are involved in online and distance education, and passionate about the opportunities that presents. So thank you for your inspiring talk, Baroness Chakrabarti. Do you have any advice for us in terms of international collaboration?
Goodness me. Well, the first thing to say is that is the other way in which your work really inspires me, because of course human rights work is based on international values. Human rights are an international language. Just like music. And this is a moment in world history where there's a choice to make, isn't there, between greater internationalism and collaboration on the one hand in every sphere of life, or nationalism, division, polarisation, war. And I think that the fact that you are so international and collaborative is one of your greatest strengths, not least because you can we learn from each other. That's the nature of collaboration, isn't it? And so you can fit it into your own community. Your own community is your greatest resource in terms of. I keep referring back to your book, but it is one of the things that bursts out of the pages of that book, that you're drawing on the experience of experiments, if you like, in this kind of learning from different universities and from all over the world. And I think that is something to really build on. in the future, because this work cannot just be handed. I know you've got wonderful sponsors, but at the same time, I discussed the Fujitsu disaster, the post office disaster. It's really important that human beings from all over the world are sharing their experience working with this technology, rather than just going to a big company, a big tech company somewhere, sitting in Silicon Valley. It's more like an empire, whereas you are more like a global democratic community. And I think that's how I see you, and I think that's how you should see yourselves, and never give away the agency and the power and the innovation to a big tech empire that won't be about empowering and interrogating the different experience in the way that you can.
Thank you. I'm really liking that. Thank you. That's a brilliant response. And actually, having the privilege of working within Code and working with colleagues from around the globe, I totally agree with you. The opportunities to share and understand, particularly to understand the challenges that students and learners face in different contexts, is so important to the work that we do. And I know that everybody in this room and in our online audience is very much committed to that sharing and understanding. And it's also, I think, really interesting that we have got our sponsors with us, because they are very much working in the space to, well, my experience working with the sponsors is that they want us to tell them what they're doing wrong and engage with them and share feedback from our students, from our staff, and so on. So it's actually very helpful. And in times of difficulty, and certainly for the University of London, when we moved, when we went into COVID and we had to deliver hundreds of thousands of examinations to students across the globe in a secure way, having a technology partner who could support us in that process was so valuable. And it didn't work that smoothly, but they listened and they responded, and we engaged and we developed together. And I think that's been very, very, very powerful for the University of London, and that's just one example. I've got a question here. Thank you to those submitting questions. Example of one's informational cultural diet being used as evidence of criminal tendencies is also reminiscent of the USA Patriot Act after 9/11, where library borrowing act records were subject to scrutiny, scary stuff. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Well, I mean, you take me back to a very formative time, and you spoke of COVID, which of course was like in a way it was like a World War experience, wasn't it? I mean, in Britain alone, I think we had twice as many casualties from COVID as we did civilian casualties in World War II. So COVID was obviously a huge experience, and it is again reflected in your book, because there's a beautiful case study which is really an expansion of what we were just outlining, and I love the self-criticism as well, because that's how we learn. But for me, earlier still, very formative part of my career as a human rights lawyer was 9/11, the war on terror, and of course in America, the Patriot Act. Now, if you think about the Patriot Act, where people's library borrowing habits were sometimes used to suggest their politics or their patriotism, think about how much easier it could be to stereotype people in a much more online environment. Whether it's people's viewing habits or musical taste or reading habits, and we have seen around the world people prosecuted, even in recent years for what they've been reading, reading material they're carrying, and so on. And we have to be just so careful about that. And in the code and right context in particular, at the design stage, and in the just kind of the ethical codes that you develop and the approach that you take, I think it's really important that students and teachers feel that this is a safe space, that the the intimacy and the trust of a traditional classroom is not lost because of the technology and potential fears of who might be listening when I'm in a seminar discussing a difficult geopolitical issue, for example. But again, your strength comes partly from the internationalism, because you have people in your community at any particular time who are really vigilant for that. Sometimes in the UK we get a bit complacent about things like that, but you have colleagues all around the world who will be reminding you of the sensitivities and difficulties of not honouring, you know, privacy in particular in an educational and higher educational environment.
Absolutely, I think that is definitely one of the challenges, certainly for the University of London with students in 190 countries. We recognise that the regulations and the expectations within different countries may be different around what can be discussed freely, and providing safe spaces for students has always been a considerable priority. Absolutely, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments from the room or online? Yes, I've got a question here. I think the mic's coming your way. If you don't speak into the mic, the people online can't hear the question, even though in the room we can hear you beautifully.
Thank you, Baroness Chakrabarti, for the talk. I think one of the things I'm really keen to hear about is just from the question posted online, is about the government's international education strategy. And I think the concern for some of us is that University of London have been in this space for a long time, doing it for the right reasons. There's now almost a push from the government for universities to look towards transnational education, operate in jurisdictions that they're not familiar with, that have very different human rights, very different attitudes to equality, diversity, inclusion. So we're just really keen to hear your thoughts on any advice you have on how we as a sector can best navigate that, spreading the good work that we do, but also not compromising on our values.
Thank you. I mean, in a sense, it feels like a development of an earlier discussion we were having about, and you're quite right to bring in whatever mixed motivations are when people say let's all be online forever and let's be international. You know, I know that because you are a genuine international academic community, this is not supposed to be imperialism. It's not supposed to be educational imperialism, where people in the global north say, well, we've got the best educational standards and degrees, so let's sell them to the world. What you want instead is the community we were discussing before, and that Belinda was discussing, which is a genuine collaboration between scholars and students all over the world to create a truly interactive, international educational experience. And I think that should be up there as one of your ethical aspirations, that this is not, we're trying to decolonize, not recolonize by this educational experience. So it's got to be sort of ground up, hasn't it? And it's got to be fed into by the people in all of these countries, not developed in one country and sold to other countries or imposed on other countries.
Thank you. Excellent question. Yeah. What a question. Sure.
Hi, Dr. Chakrabarti. This is Professor Nilesh Modi from India. I'm actually presently in the age of artificial intelligence, because I'm a professor of computer science, cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. And I'm working with open and distance learning at Ahmedabad, Gujarat. So my question is, how can online and distance education system remain technologically advanced while still preserving empathy, inclusion, and meaningful human connection for the diverse learners? Because we have diverse learners all across the globe. Yeah. So how exactly we can mix both the technologically advancement, because we are in the age of artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, and we have to cover more and more learners in an open and distance learning and online learning. So what is your say?
I'm personally quite cautious about artificial intelligence, That does not mean that I'm a Luddite and I don't think it has its role. But I think that it should be, not just in education, but in other spheres of life, it should be serving the human experience. And that means that we need to be thinking ahead. We need to be thinking about why AI for any particular purpose. And then we need to think very, very carefully about the data, the training data, and about where and how we deploy it. And we shouldn't do it just because we can. There is sometimes an understandable human urge to do it because we can, climb the mountain because it's there. I don't think one deploys AI just because we might or just because we can. And if we do choose to deploy AI in any given context, have some very serious guardrails about the training data, about the transparency, about the copyright, about everything that affects the human experience. I also think that even where you are beginning to deploy it, you think about the overall experience. Technology isn't just about saying humans will be taught by computers. It's about saying, we can create a virtual classroom. We can do things to enable our connectivity with each other, as we've been doing with this conference already, rather than just hand the teaching over to the AI because we can, or because it will be cheaper in the long run. And also perhaps having diverse experiences and continuing to experiment and perhaps run courses in different ways and test people's experiences. But what we mustn't do is to dehumanize. And that's not just in the most dramatic ways of manipulation and discrimination and abuse and so on, but also in terms of just this connectivity. When people look each other in the eye, they get something that they don't get just by typing at each other. And if I, for example, accidentally make a joke that hurts your feelings, I might be able to detect it in a little wince or a little expression on your face that makes me realise that I may have hurt your feelings. And I'll say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, it's a silly joke. I didn't mean." Do you take my point? And that's not always possible in a purely typed experience, particularly if there's a limit to how many words I use. So I just throw that in there to, I don't think I've given you an answer, but I do think don't just use AI because it's there. And we have to be really careful about the quality as well of the information that's coming back, because I have occasionally experimented with asking ChatGPT or something a question that I know the historical answer to, and I've seen the errors of history and judgment that come back. So there's leaving the humanitarian aspect out of it, there are serious quality issues to consider as well.
Absolutely, thank you. Do we have a question on that?
Yeah, so there's a discussion about like AI, and then it has its own mind, and then AI should have rights as well, like the human rights. So what's your opinion about this?
Should AI have rights like a human? And human rights are for human beings. Is my position on that. If we get to some future dystopian moment where we're literally talking about transhumans, then we'll cope with this at that time. But A, we're not there yet, and B, human rights are for human beings. Now, for example, we know that other creatures in the animal kingdom have highly functioning brains and feelings, and we know that there can be such a thing as animal cruelty, but that doesn't mean we extend human rights to animals. One of the reasons why we shouldn't be cruel to animals is that it is dehumanizing, it is inhumane, and it does something to the perpetrator and to the wider society that tolerates, for example, animal cruelty. And there is, I'm sure you know this, there is research about the dehumanising effect of allowing and facilitating cruelty to animals, even for young children growing up thinking, if you think cruelty is okay, it's a very short hop from being cruel to an animal to being cruel to a fellow human. So if you were training AI, for example, you wouldn't want to train it to tolerate and become accustomed to cruelty as a behaviour or a value, not least because that will, what goes around will come around very quickly with AI. But I don't currently see a very fruitful a line of inquiry in terms of extending human rights to AI. We should be tempering AI. We should be controlling AI. We should be deploying it with enormous care and much greater transparency than is currently the case, where people are engaging with AI and don't even realise that this isn't a human. When they are applying for a job, when they are looking for someone to date online, when they are, there are so many interactions now, including interactions that involve quite serious decisions being made about somebody's life, which prison they get sent to, which parts of town, the facial recognition will happen in, who gets a job interview, who gets insurance. So many important decisions are now being made, at least partly by AI, in different parts of the world. And that's the human rights concern that I have, not whether AI should have rights.
Thank you. I think that also speaks to our role as educators, preparing our students not just to use AI, but to live in that world where AI may be used to discriminate and to control and so on. Thank you. We've got a question on the board about the most vulnerable having a chance to have education, but noting that for online and distance education, humane online and distance education, that requires that they have access to infrastructure. And we know that the digital divide within the UK and across the globe is a very, very real thing. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Absolutely, but it is partly, it's discussed very well in your book, actually, particularly in the, can't remember which chapter it is, it's 21 or 22, the chapter on inclusion. There's a very interesting discussion of this kind of thing. Yes, we know, don't we, because COVID was the global experiment in this, that domestically and globally, that during COVID, people's educational experience was hugely different, depending on whether they actually had the kit, whether they had the resources and the kit to have that online education. And so I think we might, in the future, need to forget about robot rights. We might need to enhance our human rights so that a right to access to the online universe becomes a sort of internationally accepted right in itself. Because otherwise we are cutting out, and otherwise we're going backwards and not forwards. We're going back to previous centuries rather than forwards, because there'll be such a divide between those who are part of this exciting new world, where even other things like banking and learning are no longer available in the old forms. We could be cutting people out rather than including them.
Absolutely. I think you're very right. And colleagues from our international communities speak often about the challenges students face in terms of the digital divide, and not just the digital divide, but the electricity divide, the power divide, and so on. Yeah. We're going to have to stop there. I think we could probably go on all day. So thank you very much. Thank you so much, Baroness Chakrabarti.